Long before it carved runways across islands in the Pacific or opened roads for the Red Ball Express in France, the Caterpillar D7 tractor entered the war quietly. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, no speeches. It was not a weapon, it was not armor. It was a machine built for farms, construction sites, and civil projects. Yet, as the United States prepared for a global conflict unlike any before, a simple truth began to rise through the layers of planning. Armies did not move by courage alone. They moved by supply, by fuel, by ammunition, by roads, by runways, and by the ability to shape the battlefield faster than the enemy could destroy it. The D7 was not built to fight, but it was built to move the earth. And that single ability made it one of the most important machines of World War II. In the years before the war, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers examined dozens of civilian tractors. They needed a machine that could survive brutal environments, pull immense weight, and work day and night without failing. The Caterpillar D7, first produced in 1938, quickly stood out. Its diesel engine delivered steady power. Its frame was simple but nearly unbreakable. Its tracks gripped sand, mud, rock, and volcanic ash with equal determination. It did not complain, it did not stall, it did not quit. Army engineers saw in the D7 something rare, a machine that could be trusted under any condition. When war erupted, the requirements of modern combat became painfully clear. Tanks needed roads, artillery needed firing platforms, air forces needed runways, supply dumps, and maintenance areas, and every advancing army needed pathways carved across continents. The D7 was the only tractor that could do all of these things with the speed and reliability war demanded. Commanders quickly learned a simple rule that would appear again and again throughout the conflict. Tanks could break through enemy lines, bombers could pound enemy positions, infantry could seize ground, but none of it mattered if the army could not keep moving, and the army could not keep moving without the D7. The first proving ground for the D7 was the North African desert. Here, under the burning sun and in sandstorms that blinded even seasoned soldiers, the D7 performed tasks that could only be described as impossible. When Sherman tanks bogged down in soft sand, D7 tractors hauled them out. When roads washed away in rare desert rains, D7 crews cut new routes in hours. When artillery units needed stable firing positions on uneven dunes, D7 blades flattened wide, solid platforms. In the chaos after the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where American units struggled to reorganize, D7 tractors were among the first machines to restore order. They pulled wrecks off the roads, cleared the paths for reinforcements, and shaped the terrain so supply convoys could reach frontline units before the next German attack. Engineers who served in North Africa wrote home with the D7 with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. One described the tractor as a stubborn mule made of steel that refused to die no matter what the desert threw at it. Another wrote that the D7 worked like a soldier who never slept, pushing sand and stone as if it were nothing. For many of these engineers, the D7 became more than a machine. It became a symbol of resilience in a campaign full of setbacks. While tanks burned and trucks broke down, the D7 kept moving, clearing, pulling, and building. As the war expanded, the importance of the D7 only grew. American commanders planning the invasions of Sicily and Italy realized that the beaches would not only be defended by enemy soldiers, but by nature itself. Steep slopes, deep sand, bomb craters, and shattered obstacles could trap entire landing forces. A bulldozer could push these obstacles aside, but a bulldozer alone was not enough. The Army needed a machine that could carve roads inland from the beaches, create supply dumps, and prepare staging grounds for artillery and tanks. The D7 was designed for exactly this kind of work, and so it shipped by the hundreds across the Atlantic, lashed to the decks of transport ships, waiting for the moment it would begin building the foundations of the Allied advance. The D7 was also simple enough that engineers could modify it for battlefield conditions. They added winches to pull tanks and trucks free. They added protective cages to shield drivers from debris and shrapnel. They added angled blades for clearing paths through forests or pushing wreckage aside in ruined towns. With each theater of war, the D7 evolved. In Italy, they climbed muddy mountain roads. In Sicily, they cleared rocky hillsides. In North Africa, they battled sand and heat. The machine did everything asked of it and more. It became the workhorse of the Corps of Engineers, the answer to every question about how to move forces forward. Officers began to notice a pattern. Whenever the front stalled, a D7 appeared. Whenever roads collapsed, a D7 rebuilt them. Whenever vehicles clogged the approaches to battlefields, a D7 dragged them aside. And whenever the army needed a new airfield, a D7 sculpted it out of raw earth. Over time, commanders began using a phrase that captured the truth of the war more clearly than any battlefield speech. Without the D7, nothing moves. By the time the Allies prepared for their largest operations, including Normandy and the island assaults in the Pacific, the D7 had already proven itself indispensable. Commanders no longer debated whether the machine should be used. They debated how many they could bring. The D7 had become more than a tractor. It was the backbone of mobility. It was the machine that made every advance possible. It was the tool that turned hostile terrain into usable ground and chaos into order.
When the Caterpillar D7 first arrived in North Africa, most American soldiers saw it as a useful tool. But no one yet understood that it would soon become the single most important machine for building the air power the Allies needed to win the war. The P-40s, P-51s, A-20s, and B-25s that filled the skies were lethal, fast, and decisive, yet none of them could take off without a runway. And runways do not appear by accident. They are carved, scraped, flattened, and shaped out of raw earth. They are born from diesel engines, steel blades, and men willing to work while shells whistled overhead. This was the realm of the D7. In North Africa, the war moved too quickly for traditional construction. Airfields had to follow the battle. When the front shifted 50 miles in a day, aircraft needed new places to land within hours. The D7 answered this challenge. Engineers drove them into barren stretches of sand, scraping the ground flat until it resembled a smooth, hard surface long enough for fighters or medium bombers. At Fade Pass, engineers built an emergency strip for P-40s, while German artillery fired from the hills. The D7s ran without pause. By dawn, aircraft were landing and refueling on ground that had been wild desert only hours before. It was the first of hundreds of runways the machine would create. When the Allies invaded Sicily in 1943, the importance of the D7 skyrocketed. The island was mountainous, rocky, and unforgiving. Air support was crucial, especially for the infantry fighting through narrow passes and steep ridges. Within 24 hours of landing, engineers deployed their D7s to clear rubble, flatten hillsides, and carve out runways for P-51s and A-20 Havocs. German forces attempted to shell the construction sites, knowing that without air cover, the American and British advance would slow. But the D7s kept moving, sparks flying as their blades struck stone. One engineer later wrote that the sound of steel hitting rock became the soundtrack of Sicily. The machine worked so quickly that by the time German commanders realized an airfield was being built, fighters were already taking off from it. In one operation near Gela, a D7 carved the final section of runway while an American pilot watched from a circling P-40. As soon as the tractor backed away, the pilot landed, rearmed, and returned to the fight. The runway had taken less than a day to build, an achievement unheard of before the war. Italy pushed the D7 harder than ever before. The landscape was a patchwork of hills, ruined cities, and fields turned to mud by constant rain. Airfields had to be built wherever the terrain allowed even slightly. In Salerno, engineers used D7s to cut terraces into slopes to create improvised landing zones. Near Anzio, they built runways under the constant threat of Luftwaffe raids. At one site, engineers filled shell craters as fast as they appeared. A pilot described landing between two still smoking holes as the bravest landing of his life, but he could land because the D7 crews refused to stop. The machine's greatest test, however, came in Normandy. When the Allies landed in June 1944, there were no airfields nearby. Every foot of ground inland had to be won by infantry before engineers could even begin to think about construction. But once the front stabilized, the race began. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs supporting the breakout needed bases close to the front to maintain pressure on German armor and communications. The moment engineers captured enough open space, the D-7s rolled in. At A-1 Saint-Pierre-du-Mont, the first Allied airstrip in Normandy, engineers landed with the second wave. They fought through machine gun fire to reach the flat farmland behind Omaha Beach. Within 48 hours, D-7s had transformed fields filled with shell holes and debris into a runway long enough for fighters or medium bombers. The first P-47s landed on that strip while smoke still drifted from the ruins behind the beach. A pilot later wrote, "I touched down on a runway carved out of chaos. It should not have existed, but the bulldozers built it anyway." Over the next 6 weeks, the D-7s built nearly 40 airfields across Normandy. Some were simple dirt strips. Others were complex networks with parking areas, maintenance zones, and fuel dumps. Each time the front moved forward, the D-7s chased it, carving new airfields so American fighters could maintain constant pressure on German armor and communications. It was a cycle that defined the campaign. The infantry advanced, the D-7s built runways, the fighters took off, the tanks pushed deeper, and then the cycle repeated. The job was dangerous. German artillery frequently targeted construction sites. Luftwaffe aircraft dove low to strafe the engineers, but the D-7 crews kept working, often refusing to abandon their machines even when enemy fire was close enough to kick mud onto their uniforms. One engineer in Normandy described hiding under his D-7 during a bombing run, listening to fragments ping off the blade. When the attack ended, he climbed back up, started the engine, and kept scraping. To him, the runway was not just a strip of earth. It was the lifeline the Army needed to survive. The Pacific would push the D-7 even further. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima swallowed boots and tires whole, but the D-7 carved runways for P-51s and B-29s in it anyway. In the Philippines, the machine plowed through jungles thick enough to stop tanks. In Saipan and Tinian, D-7s built runways long enough for heavy bombers, often while Japanese snipers hid in the nearby vegetation. Each runway became a platform for American air power, shrinking the distance to Japan and tightening the strategic noose. Part 2 ends with the image of a D-7 sitting at the edge of a newly carved runway, its blades still hot, its engine still humming, while the first P-51 of the day roars overhead and lifts into the sky. The pilot owes his takeoff to the machine below him. The infantry beyond the horizon owes its survival to that takeoff. And the war itself moves closer to victory because a tractor, never designed for battle, turned empty ground into runways that carried the fight across continents.
When the breakout from Normandy finally happened in late July 1944, the Allied armies surged across the French countryside with a speed that shocked even their own commanders. Armored divisions raced toward Avranches, infantry regiments marched day and night, columns of trucks stretched for miles. But behind the glory and the headlines was a truth that every officer understood with crystal clarity. An army that moves fast dies fast if its supply lines cannot keep up. Fuel tanks run dry, rifles go silent, artillery guns become useless pieces of iron. And so, to keep the advance alive, America created something the world had never seen, an around-the-clock, non-stop supply highway known as the Red Ball Express. But the Red Ball Express did not run by miracle. It ran because the Caterpillar D-7 carved and maintained every mile of ground it touched. France, in 1944, was not designed for modern mechanized warfare. Roads were narrow, crumbling, and clogged with the wreckage of retreating German units. Bridges had been blown. Fields were saturated by weeks of rain and shelling. Forest paths twisted unpredictably. Every inch of terrain, from Normandy's hedgerows to the plains around Paris, was scarred by craters, trenches, and collapsed masonry. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition could not simply drive through this landscape. They needed roads wide enough, strong enough, and smooth enough to support tens of thousands of tons of supplies every single day. The only machine capable of creating those roads under battlefield conditions was the D-7. In the first days of the breakout, the D-7s worked at a feverish pace. Engineers used them to widen narrow roads so two-way traffic could flow. They cut bypasses around destroyed bridges. They carved emergency detours through fields when towns became choked with rubble. A single D-7 working non-stop could create a new supply route in hours. Without these improvised roads, the Red Ball Express would have stalled before it ever left Normandy. One truck driver later wrote, "When you saw a bulldozer on the side of the road, you knew you were safe. Without it, you knew you might be stuck for days." The scale of the operation defied belief. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved over 12,000 tons of supplies every day. Nearly 6,000 trucks ran continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But trucks are fragile. They break, they bog down, they flip on sharp curves. They cannot cross soft ground. Each of these problems became a crisis unless a D-7 was nearby to fix it. Near Le Mans, a sudden rainstorm turned an entire stretch of road into a river of mud. The trucks of the Red Ball Express sank to their axles, unable to move. The entire army risked grinding to a halt. Engineers rushed in with D-7s. They scraped away the mud, laid down crushed stone using the tractors as rollers, and rebuilt the road in less than a day. The convoy resumed movement. A truck driver who witnessed the event said simply, "The bulldozer saved France that day." The D-7 did more than build roads. It cleared wreckage faster than retreating German forces could create it. Abandoned half-tracks, overturned horse carts, shattered panzers, damaged American Shermans. Everything became an obstacle that blocked the advance. The D-7s pushed them aside like toys. Some obstacles were too heavy, even for the tractors to push directly, so engineers used the D-7 as an anchor, attaching winches and dragging wrecks off cliffs or into ditches. Every time they cleared a path, the supply line breathed again. There were days when the D-7s felt like the only stable force in a world of chaos. A driver in the Red Ball Express once described watching a D-7 carve a bypass through an orchard while German artillery landed all around it. The tractor did not stop. The engineer kept the blade lowered, grinding through tree roots and soil until a line of trucks could continue on their mission. When asked later why he kept working under fire, the operator shrugged and said, "If we do not move, they do not move. And if they do not move, we lose." As American forces approached Paris, the D-7s continued their relentless work. They reopened bridges the Germans had destroyed by building approaches along the riverbanks. They widened boulevards inside the city to allow tank columns to pass. When retreating German units sabotaged intersections with rubble, mines, and destroyed vehicles, the D-7s cleared the mess before dawn. Paris was liberated not only by rifles and tanks, but by machines that made sure reinforcements and ammunition could reach the front. But the most dramatic chapter for the D-7 during the French campaign came after Paris, when the Allied advance slowed near the German border. The reason was simple. The Red Ball Express had outrun the roads. Trucks were traveling hundreds of miles each day, but the infrastructure beneath them was crumbling. The D-7s stepped in to perform miracles. Engineers rebuilt roads in Belgium and Luxembourg. They cut entirely new routes through forests to bypass destroyed towns. They shaped flat areas that became refueling points and temporary depots. Every part of the advance was tied to the D-7's blade. By the end of 1944, American engineers estimated that D-7 tractors had helped open or maintain more than 10,000 kilometers of supply roads. Every gallon of fuel used by Patton's tanks, every artillery shell fired at the German retreat, every meal delivered to a frontline company, every wounded soldier evacuated. All of it moved along pathways the D7 had carved through a continent at war. Part 3 ends with an image that defines the campaign. A long line of trucks from the Red Ball Express roars down a makeshift road at dusk, dust rising behind them like smoke. At the head of the line, a single D7 moves forward slowly, its blades scraping the earth, shaping the way. Behind the wheel, an engineer leans forward, eyes fixed, hands steady. He is not famous. He will not be celebrated in newsreels. But without him, the road would not exist. Without him, the trucks would not move. Without him, the army would starve on the battlefield. The D7 does not fight the enemy directly. It fights the terrain itself. And every battle it wins keeps an entire army alive.
By 1944, the Caterpillar D7 had already proven itself across North Africa, Sicily, and France. But its greatest tests still lay ahead. In Europe, the D7 battled mud, rubble, and cratered roads. In the Pacific, it faced something far more savage. The terrain itself became the enemy. Black volcanic ash, jagged coral, steaming jungles, and beaches so steep they swallowed vehicles whole. And standing behind the terrain were Japanese defenders who turned every inch of ground into a fortress. Yet the D7 did what no other machine could. It transformed the impossible into the survivable, and the survivable into the conquerable. The first major example came during the invasion of Sicily and the drive up Italy. The beaches at Gela, Licata, and Salerno were crowded with wreckage from landing craft, blasted obstacles, collapsed seawalls, and deep craters left by German and Italian artillery. Without cleared lanes, infantry would bottleneck under fire. Tanks would drown in shell holes. Artillery could never be pulled ashore. The solution, as always, was the D7. The tractors rolled down from LST ramps and landing craft into water deep enough to touch their engines. Drivers kept their hands steady as bullets cracked over the waves. Once ashore, the D7s went straight to work. They carved ramps up the dunes, dragged vehicles out of the surf, widened exits from the beach, and cleared lanes for tanks pushing inland. In one dramatic moment at Gela, a German counterattack threatened to push American infantry back into the sea. Tanks could not reach the front line because the beach road was blocked by burning vehicles. A D7 driver, fully exposed, used his blade to push a flaming half-track off the road while mortar shells exploded around him. His actions opened the path, and the tanks surged forward to stop the counterattack. Soldiers later said that if he had hesitated for even 10 seconds, the beach would have been lost. Italy presented different challenges. Mountain roads were narrow, slippery, and often crumbling. German engineers blew landslides across the passes to slow the Allied advance. The D7s became the answer every time. They cut new roads into the sides of hills, pushed rock slides aside, and built flat firing positions on slopes for American artillery. When tanks bogged down in the soft ground of the Liri Valley, the D7s hauled them free, grinding their tracks through mud that swallowed jeeps whole. The Italian campaign became a grinding war of inches, and almost every inch was won with the help of a D7 blade. But nothing prepared the D7 crews for the Pacific. In Europe, terrain resisted. In the Pacific, it fought back. On Saipan and Tinian, engineers found beaches of soft coral sand that collapsed under the weight of vehicles. Tanks dug themselves into holes. Trucks spun their wheels uselessly. The D7s were the only machines that could grip the shifting ground. Their blades scraped coral into flat paths. Their tracks churned through sand without sinking, and their engines hauled artillery guns across terrain that should have been impossible. On Tinian, D7s built runways so quickly that B-29 bombers were landing on the island less than 2 weeks after the invasion. Those runways became the launch sites for the bombing campaign that eventually reached Japan itself. Then came Iwo Jima. No other battlefield tested the D7 like that island did. The ground was not sand, it was volcanic ash, deep and heavy, swallowing boots, wheels, and tracks. The defenders were not scattered,
They were dug into caves, tunnels, and bunkers carved into stone. The beaches offered no firm surface, no traction, no comfort. And yet the D-7s rolled off the landing craft and into the ash. The tractors sunk up to half the height of their tracks with every push. Drivers kept the engines roaring to avoid stalling. Mortar fire erupted around them. Sniper rounds bounced off improvised armor plates bolted onto the cabs. Still, they moved forward. Their mission was to carve paths for tanks and artillery. Without those paths, the Marines would attack without fire support. Casualties would skyrocket. Entire battalions could be wiped out. A D-7 driver on Iwo Jima described the work as trying to dig a trench on the surface of the moon while the moon shoots at you. But he kept pushing, blade down, ash flying in thick clouds behind him. Marines used the paths he carved as lifelines. Tanks followed him inches at a time, their engines straining against the ash. Artillery crews pulled their guns into firing positions using the routes he cut. In many sectors, the battle simply could not have moved forward without the D-7. The most dramatic moment came when engineers needed to break through the final defensive belts near the base of Mount Suribachi. Japanese bunkers were arranged to create overlapping fire. Infantry could not advance. Tanks bogged down in the ash. The D-7 crews volunteered to push forward under direct fire. They used their blades to cover embrasures with tons of ash and collapsed tunnel entrances by pushing loose rock over them. Each push helped seal a deadly position, allowing infantry to move. One Marine officer later said, "The D-7 did not just build roads on Iwo Jima, it won the island." Everywhere the D-7 went in the Pacific, the pattern repeated. On Peleliu, it dragged wounded Marines from no man's land when medics couldn't reach them. On Luzon, it cleared jungle thick enough to swallow entire squads. On Okinawa, it built roads over shattered cliffs where tanks had no business traveling. On every island, the D-7 turned terrain designed to kill into terrain that supported life. Part 4 ends with a powerful scene. A D-7 stands on Iwo Jima at dusk, its blade buried in black ash, its exhaust rising like smoke into the sky. The Marines around it sit exhausted, leaning on their rifles, alive because the tractor carved the ground beneath their feet. In the distance, the American flag flutters atop Suribachi. The battle is not over, but victory is now possible because a machine built for farms and construction sites learned to fight volcanoes, jungles, beaches, and war itself.
When the war finally ended, and the guns fell silent across Europe and the Pacific, the world took stock of the machines that had shaped the outcome. The P-51 Mustang ruled the skies. The M4 Sherman overwhelmed the battlefields. The Liberty ship carried the arsenal of democracy across oceans. But when American engineers gathered after the war to evaluate what truly kept the Allied armies moving, they did not point to a tank, a plane, or a ship. They pointed to a tractor. A steel-tracked, diesel-powered, dirt-covered tractor that had no armor and no weapons. A machine that did not fight the enemy, but fought the ground he stood on. The Caterpillar D-7. In the months following victory, reports flowed into the Corps of Engineers headquarters from every theater of war. They came from France, Belgium, Italy, the Philippines, Okinawa, and dozens of tiny islands whose names few Americans had heard before the war. The message in all of them was the same. The D-7 had been the backbone of Allied mobility. It had made the impossible possible. And without it, countless operations would have collapsed under their own weight. Field commanders described the D-7 as the silent partner of every major offensive. When the infantry needed a path through rubble, the D-7 built it. When tanks needed to cross streams or ravines, the D-7 carved ramps and filled gaps. When artillery needed firing positions, the D-7 flattened hillsides and scraped platforms out of mud. When planes needed runways, the D-7 built them out of jungle, coral, ash, and farmland. It shaped the terrain of 3 continents and dozens of islands often under machine gun fire, artillery bombardment, or tropical storms. Many officers admitted openly that without the D-7, the war would have moved slower by months. Tanks would have bogged down, trucks would have been stranded, Red Ball Express convoys would have stalled. Airfields would have taken weeks instead of days. Amphibious assaults would have choked on their own beach congestion. The D-7 did not just support the war, it accelerated it. It shortened it. It saved lives by the thousands. Engineers remembered the D-7 not as a piece of machinery, but as a companion. They talked about its engine rumble like a steady heartbeat, and the way its tracks clawed through mud with quiet determination. They remembered leaning against its warm metal sides during freezing nights. They remembered fixing broken hoses under fire and jumping back into the seat before shrapnel struck. They remembered the comfort of knowing that if the D-7 was with them, there was no obstacle they could not overcome. Some stories became part of military folklore. In France, a D-7 driver worked 72 hours without rest, sleeping only when the engine overheated, waking as soon as it cooled. In Italy, a D-7 carved a road up a hillside so steep that infantry climbed it on all fours. In the Pacific, a D-7 pushed its way through jungle so dense that soldiers behind it could see nothing but a vibrating wall of green. In Iwo Jima, a D-7 was hit by a mortar that blew open its side panels. The driver patched the hole with scrap metal, restarted the engine, and finished clearing the path for the Marines behind him. After the war, American strategists asked a difficult question. How had the Allies achieved the most mobile military campaign in history on two continents simultaneously? They concluded that mobility itself had become a weapon, and the D-7 was the tool that forged that weapon. The D-7 built the fuel dumps for Patton's tanks. It built the ammunition pits for the island-hopping Marines. It built the roads that carried millions of tons of supplies. It built the runways that launched the fighters and bombers that broke the Axis war machine. It built the temporary ports, the fire bases, the truck parks, the tank staging areas, the command posts, the evacuation routes. It built the very arteries of the war. Soldiers who survived because of the D-7 never forgot it. One infantryman wrote in a letter home, "They say tanks win battles. I say the bulldozers win the ground the battles are fought on." A Marine on Okinawa wrote, "The D-7 was our shield. It moved the earth so we could move forward." In France, a truck driver from the Red Ball Express said simply, "The dozer kept us alive. Without it, everything stops." Decades later, historians digging through after-action reports found a phrase repeated so often it became almost a motto. Without the D-7, nothing moves. It appeared in engineering logs, division histories, and personal diaries. It was the statement that captured the truth the soldiers always knew. The guns might win the firefight. The tanks might win the breakthrough. The planes might win the skies. But victory itself was built by the slow, steady, unstoppable blade of a machine that worked in the shadows. The legacy of the D-7 lives on not just in museums or engineering textbooks, but in the very concept of modern warfare. No military today attempts an operation without first asking the question the Allies asked in 1942 and 1943. Can we move? Can we build? Can we sustain? Can we fight the terrain? If the answer is no, they bring the bulldozers. They bring the descendants of the D-7. Part 5 ends with a quiet scene that reflects the machine's true legacy. A lone D-7 sits on a conquered battlefield, its engine silent at last. Its blade is dented, its tracks worn, its paint scraped down to bare metal. Around it lie the roads it built, the airfields it carved, the supply routes it shaped, and the ground it made safe. Armies have marched past it, victory has passed through it. And though it will never be listed among the heroes in statues or medals, every soldier who survived the war understood the truth. This machine built the path to victory. It did not fire a single bullet. It did something greater. It made winning possible.